So, today I'm going to talk to you about patterns. We all jump straight into sewing because we want to create whatever it is that we've got planned, and it's so exciting to get to the sewing machine. But there's so many tips that I'm sure you don't know when it comes to patterns. Whether you're printing them off, sticking them together and making something from that, or starting from scratch and drafting, there's so much that you can learn. And today I'm going to share with you 4 of my favourite tips for beginner sewists when it comes to patterns. So I'm sure we've all printed off that PDF, stuck it together, put it on our favourite fabric and started cutting it right out. And when we get to those darts, we snip in. Now, Esme from the Sewing Bee told me this was the worst mistake because so often we can cut straight into that seam allowance and we don't have any strength left at that point where we've cut in. What I like to do when I'm cutting out my fabric is follow that pattern piece, and when I get to a dart, cut a slight triangle so that I know I've got a little notch that extends outwards from the pattern rather than inwards, and I can use them to line up my pattern pieces. That way I'm not cutting directly into my seam, but I still have that marker when I need to reference it when I'm sewing. So one of the things that I learned really quickly from making drag outfits is that I might want to take a dress pattern that's designed typically for a female body and use that for a non-female body who is performing in drag. And one of the things that I had to learn quite quickly is how to lengthen patterns, and it's so simple. So we need to find a reference point on our pattern, and for me that might be the waistline, the bust line, or maybe the hip line, and we need to cut across all of our pattern pieces along that line. And let's say we're extending it, what we can then do is put some new paper underneath our patterns, spread the pattern apart by how much we want to increase the pattern piece by, and then we can tape the pattern pieces onto that paper. And all you have to do is carefully grade the edge. So it works great when you've got a straight edge to reference, but if you don't, you just need to take one of the points of the other pattern piece and then the next pattern piece and make sure you're blending that line back so it's a smooth line like the original pattern. Now, if we wanted to shorten, we just do the same process. We cut where we need to cut across on the pattern, so that could be again the waistline, and we overlap the pattern pieces this time, but remembering that we have to true up those edges so that we don't get any of the jagged edges. And that's how you can lengthen or shorten a pattern piece. Let's talk darts. So darts are really useful in turning our 2D pattern pieces into 3D, and I'm going to show you how to move darts, in particular the bust dart. Bust darts will center around the bust point, and you might have 1, 2, 3, as many as your pattern will say, and maybe you want to move those darts around so that you could create new style lines, princess seams, or hide those darts in other seams. From that bust point, you'll draw your new dart positions, and then we'll close up those existing darts by cutting up one of the sides of the dart, taping it together. This will start turning your 2D flat pattern piece 3D, and you'll start to see the curves that those existing darts create. When you're cutting up the darts though, make sure you don't go through that bust point because we still want to use that pivot point to create our new darts. Once you've taped up those existing darts, we can then release that tension or that shape that the darts created by cutting along our lines that we drew for the new dart positions. And you'll see that the pattern piece can then lie flat. We can then put some paper underneath, or just leave them as they are, and we've got our brand new dart positions. Now once you've got your new dart positions, you could actually then cut through the bust point to separate your one pattern piece into two, and this is great when you do want to put in princess seams onto a top. Just make sure that you're curving those points of the bust point out so you've got a smooth edge when you're sewing. This is great if you wanted to create new style lines or maybe even do some colour blocking on a pattern piece. Once you've moved those darts, you can really kind of create any shape that you want. So let's take a bodice block and draw a wiggly line to create some shape to our pattern piece. All you have to make sure is that that style line you're creating goes through that bust point. Then when we're cutting along that curvy line that we've just drew, we'll then see the new darts form along that seam. So we're actually hiding the darts completely in that new wiggly line seam that we've created. Now, the last tip that I wanted to give you is seam allowance. Some pattern pieces will come without seam allowance and some will come with, let's say, 1 centimetre seam allowance, but if you wanted to do French seams, you're going to have to extend that seam allowance on your pattern piece. So the way I like to do this is using a ruler and working out the measurement that I want to extend my pattern piece by. So for example, let's pretend that this bodice block doesn't have any seam allowance. All I want to do is create a 1 centimetre seam allowance along the whole of the pattern piece. And I'll do that by measuring marking points on a new piece of paper, tracing around that pattern piece. You can also get some really cool tools to help you with this. The tool I'm using here is from Jen from the Sewing Bee, and she's released this as part of her sewing equipment, and it comes in different sizes of seam allowance so that I can trace all the way around my pattern pieces, knowing that I'm creating that exact amount that is marked on the tool itself. So really cool if you do use a lot of patterns that either don't have seam allowance or you need to add additional seam allowance along certain seams. So that's my 4 top tips when it comes to patterns for beginners. Let me know what your top tips are before you start sewing when it comes to pattern pieces. Maybe it's how you tape your pattern pieces together or something completely different. I'd love to hear them.